Hi, Steve. I am Bernadine Vassor, a rising senior at the University of Florida. I am Haitian American, and I grew up in a low-income neighborhood. Now, I don't think being Haitian American predetermined that I would have grown up in a low-income neighborhood. However, I do think the fact that my parents were never able to achieve an education, I think that played a role. And so those three factors created a community for my siblings and I where education was the most important thing. It was amongst our top values, and as children, it was our duty to achieve. And for me, this was fairly easy. I was always able to do well in school and maintain good grades. However, for my brother and my friends and some of my peers and his friends, this wasn't always the same thing. And as I grew up, I began to realize that these people, more than likely, or most of the time, had an extenuating circumstance where some of the people around them or their fathers or just people who were in their nuclear family or around them had been in the prison system or somehow affected by the prison system. And while I'm not saying that is the reason why that is the only reason why children don't do well, I definitely think it was a contributing factor. And so I began to realize how this affected children, how it affected the people in my community. I began to realize that even though the prison system was supposed to be rehabilitative, that when these people did enter the prison system, they came out with a record. And whether that record was the actual record that they had to report to jobs and schools, or it was just a mental thing that they carried around, I began to realize how it weighed down on them and how it determined some of their other steps. I began to realize that these people with records weren't getting jobs at corporate America. They were getting jobs at Walmart and Winn-Dixie and other equivalent places for minimum wage. And I learned that, and I knew that minimum wage wasn't supporting a family of 3 in South Florida, or a family with 3 children in South Florida. And I just began to realize how these different disadvantages began to affect children almost as much as they affected adults. And then I further began to realize that for these children, as we grew up, some of these children who were affected by the prison system or around people who were affected by the prison system, they then themselves entered the prison system. By high school, I had known at least 10 people who were who had gone to juvenile detention, and some who had skipped juvenile detention and were actually tried as adults, even though we were minors. I had began to hear stories of the Khalif Browders who had spent years in prison without having actually had a trial, and those years in prison were spent in solitary confinement. I had began to know people who had left for prison one way and came out another way, and I had then heard how a lot of their time in prison was spent in solitary confinement. I had begun to see how my own peers and those who were younger than me the school to prison pipeline began to make sense when I saw the people who looked like me and were younger than me being sent to in-school suspension for simple things, when I myself was sent to in-school suspension for being late to class. I began to see how solitary confinement began when we were sent home for school suspension for simple things, for acting out, for defying authority. And I had began to see the prison pipeline displayed in my own life, in the life of my sibling, and in the life of my own friends. And it had began to make sense to me, the cyclical nature of the system. It began to make sense to me why people who looked like me weren't always doing well in school. It began to make sense to me why people who looked like me were so scared of the cops. It began to make sense to me why every time I was driving and a cop drove past me, I would push my hands to the top of the steering wheel and my heart would drop. It began to make sense to me all the disadvantages which we faced. And that's when I knew for sure why I wanted to be a lawyer. Because before then, I only wanted to be a lawyer because I wanted to argue. And then after that, it was because I wanted to attain a good life. And then after that, it was because I wanted to seek justice. But when I wanted to seek justice, justice didn't have a face, it didn't have a name. But now I knew what justice I wanted to seek. I have interest in becoming an attorney in the public sector because I want to curb the amount of students who are flooded into prison. I want to curb the prison. I want to affect the prison reform. I want to be a part in achieving a reform within prison. I want to ensure that my siblings and people who look like them don't have their futures taken away from them by one mistake. Because it is so apparently clear to me that even though I'm a student at the University of Florida, when I'm stopped by a cop, the reality is the same. When I enter a store, the reality is the same. And so I want to be an attorney because I want my own chance at I want my own chance at achieving justice. And it's so important to me to be a part of something that affects me. And it's so important to me to be a part of children who look like me not being affected by the same thing. I have grown up and I've seen the prison system in its full effect. So Steve, I thank you so much for seeing a problem and doing your part to solve it. Thank you so much for the scholarship, and I apologize for going over time.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them, and feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.